I was born in Detroit, as were my father and mother, and I graduated from the University of Michigan in 1939 and left Ann Arbor expecting never to come back. But after World War II, I did come back. And then my plan was to finish a PhD in a couple of years and then go on to a lucrative career either in the Gallup organization or competing with it. But instead, I joined a group of idealistic young optimists who were starting something called the Institute for Social Research, and I loved it. I decided to stay, and I did stay. Bea and I and our 3 daughters lived many happy years in Ann Arbor. But about 5 years ago, a few months after our 72nd wedding anniversary, my wife Bea died, and then I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to live with my daughter Marcia and my son-in-law Eric Wright. Now, that means that my medical arrangements had been changed from Ann Arbor to the University of Wisconsin system, and the UW system begins with a formal little registration process every time you visit. You go to one of a number of desks, and a clerk greets you courteously and asks you 2 questions. What is your full name and what is your date of birth? And I answer dutifully, Robert L. Kahn, March 28th, 1918. And then usually the clerk says something like, wow, go Badger. Good genes. I do not argue. I don't say that I am a Wolverine and not a mere badger. I don't dispute the question of genes. I go on to my appointments. But the gene remark brings to my mind the fact that my mother died of uncontrolled hypertension at the age of 51, as her mother had died of uncontrollable hypertension at the age of 59. My father's family didn't do much better. My grandfather, Louis Kahn, died of a sudden heart attack before I was born, and my father, his older brother, and his 2 sisters all died of heart disease, some of them in their 60s, some perhaps a little in their 70s. So good genes doesn't quite tell the story. But what makes the difference? What is it that enables some people to live longer and better than others? I'm going to try to answer that question today, but before I do, I should admit that I'm not really a gerontologist, or if I am a gerontologist, I became one rather late in the game. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that for many occupations and professions, retirement was compulsory at age 70. It was on the faculty of the University of Michigan. And so in my 70th year, which was 1988, I retired, or as one of my colleagues put it, I retired from my salary at the University of Michigan in my teaching in the School of Public Health and my research at the Institute for Social Research, where I had been studying the effects of job demands and opportunities on the health and well-being of employees. So I was not sad about retirement. I had some plans in mind. Like all Detroit boys, I was mad about cars. I did a little competitive driving, and we used to do a lot of competitive talking about the relative advantages of Cadillacs and Lincolns, Auburns and Cords, Volvos and Saabs, Fords and Chevrolets, and so on. My daughter Janet's first car was a 1965 Mustang. used, of course, a gym, and long gone. My idea was perhaps to buy a '65 Mustang and restore it to its original glory and learn a good deal in the process. And if that wasn't sufficient as retirement project one, I was going to try to convert my skills from rough carpentry to cabinet making. So while I was dreaming happily along these lines, I had a call from the MacArthur Foundation inviting me to join a group of people who were going to study aging. We were an interestingly assorted group of a dozen or more from different universities and different disciplines. I think only two of us were really gerontologists or geriatric physicians. But that did not discourage the foundation. They wanted that variety of intellectual interest. We were being led by our group by Jack Rowe, John W. Rowe, who was then at Harvard, later became president of Mount Sinai and then president of Aetna, and is now a professor at Columbia. So we began in deference to the foundation urging that we do something innovative in the field of aging. And when we asked what they meant by innovative, they said, well, we don't know, but you figure that out. So we began by reading a great deal of the research on aging, and we were struck by the fact that most of it was simply a documentation, a careful documentation of losses. How much bone density, how much height, how much visual acuity, how much mental sharpness do people lose with each passing year? We didn't dispute that research, but we were interested in the fact that it was all measures of central tendencies. There was little or no apparent interest in variety, and we were more interested in the question of that. We wanted to know why it was that some older people are on crutches and some are on skis. In other words, what makes the difference between usual and better than usual, or as we came to call it, successful aging. So that set our task for us, and we began our work, which I'm going to summarize today by trying to answer three questions. First, what do we really mean by successful aging? What does it mean to age successfully? Second, what can any of us do about it? Doesn't it all depend on genes? And third, in addition to all that, isn't the crucial question really medicine and surgery? Aren't these more important than anything else? So here goes. Let's start. What do we mean by aging successfully? We mean essentially three things. First, avoiding disease and disability. Second, maintaining physical and mental function. And third, continuing engagement with life. Each of these is important in itself, and there is a kind of hierarchical ordering among them. We don't mean that each is a yes or no answer to then what the person can do. Stephen Hawking, who is considered certainly one of the greatest physicists of the century, is severely limited, crippled by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease. But he says that, his body may be limited to a wheelchair, his mind can explore the dimensions of the universe. And Franklin Roosevelt, who led this country out of its Great Depression and through the greatest of wars, was, of course, severely limited by poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis. So we can admire and applaud these, but at the same time recognize that there are advantages, that it's a positive and important thing to be free of such limitations if possible. The second characteristic of the three ideas in defining successful aging, the second characteristic is maintaining physical and mental function. And finally, the third of the three characteristics of successful aging is continuing engagement with life. And by that we mean not necessarily activities that generate income, but staying connected with people and engaging activities that are in a broader and perhaps a deeper sense meaningful. So that's our definition, and each of these components of successful aging is to some extent separate from the others, and there's a kind of hierarchical ordering among them. Avoiding disease and disability to the extent that one can do it certainly makes it easier and more likely to be able to carry on the activities that we described as successful aging. And being able to do them is no guarantee, of course, that one will, in fact, do them. So those three components define our definition of successful aging. And that brings us to the second question of the three that we're going to cover in this relatively brief discussion. And that is, doesn't it all really depend on genes? We are now living in an era in which gene and genetic research is of tremendous importance and has accomplished already tremendous gains and has the promise of offering a great deal more. But having said that, and said it appreciatively, the gains in genetic science don't mean that genes are all important. To give you only one example, we know more about genes than we do about the conditions of life that either turn them on, make them active, or that leave them to remain as potentialities, tendencies, but not, in fact, active. And there are strategies for estimating the relative importance of genes versus lifestyle and life experience. In the MacArthur studies, we relied especially on the Swedish Twin Registry. The Swedish Twin Registry is a remarkable and extended document. It includes some 25,000 identical twins born any time between 1886 and 1956. And some of them were separated at birth or shortly after. Some of them, of course, remained together. So by comparing those two populations of twins, we can get some estimate of the relative importance of heredity versus environment. And I'll give you only three examples of what we found. First, with respect to obesity. Somewhat to my surprise, we found that genetic importance is really very great in the case of obesity. The tendency to become obese or to have difficulty in controlling your weight is more than 50% dependent on genetic factors. Looking at those numbers, I began to take more seriously the statements of some of our population that tell us that it is more difficult for them to control their weight. It may well be the case. On the other hand, lung function is almost entirely well, largely determined by life experience, especially smoking, of course, much less in old age, as lung function depend upon genetic factors. And finally, mental sharpness, to give a contrast with the other two, looks to be about half. The mental sharpness that people find in old age seems to be about half genetic and half determined by lifestyle and life experience factors. So that is what we have learned about genetics and lifestyle as determinants of successful aging. And finally, the question I put for last was one I have heard from more than one of our respondents. Doesn't it really all depend on medicine and surgery and what can be done? Well, sometimes it does. I don't mean to deprecate the importance of those things, far from it. But the main message for our research is not competition among the three factors of lifestyle and behavior, genetics, and medical surgical interventions. It's rather the importance of all three at different times and for different reasons. That is something that our research has told me. It's something that our interviews with thousands of people has emphasized, and it's something that my own experience tells me. For example, unlike my mother and grandmother, who died from high blood pressure and strokes at a time when there were no drugs for that, although I began to show the same inherited tendencies and symptoms when I was still in my 30s, I was of a generation after World War II where there were drugs to deal with hypertension, and there was advice with regard to lifestyle, exercise, weight control, diet, that would make a difference. And indeed, they did make a difference. But in spite of that, about 2 years ago, after a lifetime of diet and exercise and careful use of drugs, medicines, about 2 years ago, I began to show signs of cardiac failure caused primarily by a narrowing of the aortic valve. At age 98, the information that you may be near the end of life is neither surprising nor particularly frightening. But my cardiologist, seeing that I was otherwise in good health, felt that I should have a replacement of the aortic valve, especially since that no longer required open heart surgery. And he, I was going to say recommended it. He did more than that. He urged it, almost insisted on it, and eventually managed to persuade me. And as a result, I am now the possessor of a new aortic valve, provided, I believe, from some less fortunate animal. And it has, in fact, turned the biological clock back by about 2 years. Remarkable, and it has made life much more pleasurable and rewarding. So that is, now, colleagues, you have pretty much my story, and you know something about what we learned from the MacArthur decade of research. You, I think, are at the end of our conversation for today. I am anyway. And I can conclude only by saying that I hope your medical experiences will be as favorable, at least, and fortunate as mine. Goodbye for